Greetings, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Jeff St. John, and I'm Director of News and Special Projects at Canary Media. We're a nonprofit newsroom covering the climate crisis and the clean energy transition, and we welcome your support. We'll be sharing some information a little bit later on how you can donate to Canary Media and sign up for our newsletter. But we're here today to talk about a big and complicated topic. That is the fast-growing demand for electricity in the United States and how to meet that demand without undermining our progress on climate change. For the past 2 decades, U.S. electricity consumption has been largely flat, but that's no longer the case. Analysis firm Grid Strategies has tracked a near doubling in 5-year demand growth forecasts for U.S. utilities and grid operators, up to 38 gigawatts of new peak demand by 2038, according to that analysis. And while that demand is not happening at the same pace in every part of the country, certain sections of the country are really seeing a big jump in what they expect to need to serve in terms of new customers coming onto the grid. The lion's share of that new near-term demand growth is being driven by proposed data center expansions. Some forecasts see a doubling or even tripling of U.S. data center power consumption through 2030. But big factories, including those building the EVs and batteries and solar panels that are part of the clean energy transition, are also part of that mix. And eventually electric vehicles and electric building heating is also going to be a big part of that. And this could, I stress, could present a significant threat to the energy transition. And in particular, that really depends on how utilities and regulators handle things. And we've been focusing recently on how that threat is emerging in the U.S. Southeast. Right now, utilities including Duke Energy, Southern Company, and the Tennessee Valley Authority are proposing major build-outs of new fossil gas-powered power plants to meet these looming power demands. The Southern Environmental Law Center is tracking plans to add an estimated 33 gigawatts of new gas plants over the next decade across the Southeast region. And that expansion is almost certainly incompatible with U.S. commitments to power sector emissions reductions under the Paris Agreement and with the Biden administration's goals. But there are alternatives to this rushed gas build-out that are cleaner and almost certainly cheaper. And they may also offer greater reliability for an overstressed grid that's stressed not just by new load growth, but by extreme weather. So what are these alternatives and how can they be implemented? Well, that's what we're here today to discuss. And joining me to tackle these topics are 3 experts on the subject that we're about to cover. I want to say thanks again for joining us. First, we have Priya Barua. Priya is Senior Director of Market and Policy Innovation at the Clean Energy Buyers Association. This group represents hundreds of companies procuring clean energy across the country, including major data center operators like Amazon, Google, Meta, and Microsoft. Next, we have Simon Mahan. He's Executive Director and a 10-year veteran at the Southern Renewable Energy Association, which is a nonprofit trade association focused on promoting clean energy in the South. And last but not least, we have Maggie Schober. Maggie is Research Director at the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, which is a nonprofit working for responsible and equitable energy choices across the Southeast. So let's get right into it. And if you don't mind, Maggie, I'd like to start with you. You've been tracking these activities across the Southeast. Can you give us a rundown on what's happening with the Southeast utilities proposing these significant fossil gas power plant build-outs and what's happening in the regulatory proceedings about them, and how and when are folks who want to promote cleaner alternatives getting a chance to do that?
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. Great to be here with you all. Such great company here on this conversation today. So yeah, to kind of get us started on the lay of the land with new gas proposals in the Southeast, I'll start with saying that these did not just pop up out of nowhere. Southeast utilities have been proposing new gas. This is, what these mostly vertically integrated investor-owned utilities in the region know, what they're comfortable with. And so certainly when they see the level of load growth that we're now seeing, this is their, immediate knee-jerk reaction. And what we're seeing is proposals across the major utilities in the Southeast I'll start with TVA because they have the largest near-term proposal, and they started with a number of really large combined cycles or CC plants to replace coal, and have since moved on to propose additional CCs as well as CTs, combustion turbines, or peaker plants. And they have anywhere from 5 to 6 or more gigawatts planned by 2028. Then moving south to Georgia Power, which just finished a surprise IRP as they're gearing up for another IRP next year. They, in addition to some fossil fuel PPAs, also proposed a 1.3 gigawatt combustion turbine project at their existing Yates site. And we do expect, we have seen in the Georgia Power queue, we do expect quite a bit more gas to be proposed by Georgia Power in their next IRP, which is just around the corner in IRP terms in January of 2025. But I think the elephant in the room is Duke Energy. They have a very, very large amount of gas planned for their two utilities that they operate in North and South Carolina. They have been on about a 2 or 3 year track for their IRP cycles. Notably, Duke does have a carbon reduction goal legislated in North Carolina that they have said over the last 2 IRP cycles, this one and the previous one, that they are not able to meet. And obviously, proposing new gas is not helping them in that situation in the least. And so yeah, Duke Energy came back. They originally filed their IRP in both North and South Carolina in August of last year, and January, and said, "Oops, we have a lot more load growth even than we had expected," and so upped their load growth and upped the amount of gas. So they are at nearly 9 gigawatts total proposed just for North and South Carolina utilities. So it's all around, and it's significant. It's a combination of new CCs and new CTs. Several require new pipelines or at least new laterals or expansion of existing pipelines. Gotcha. So I'll pause there for the next bit.
All right. Well, that's the situation at play right now, and so I think it's important now to talk about what the alternatives can be. And Simon, I'd like to ask you to help us understand that. I think the utilities have a number of alternative options on hand. It's not clear to me how those have come about and in what ways utilities and regulators are engaging in them. But can you help us understand what the alternatives are at play? How they propose to manage meeting the growth in demand that is being forecasted now, and what challenges exist in giving those alternatives equal opportunity in the processes that we're talking about?
Yeah, thanks for that. So our organization really focuses on the utility scale side of the equation. So we focus on large scale wind, solar, batteries, transmission. We have some folks that are interested in hydrogen production in the Southeast. But this particular question that we're faced with right now of significant expansion of load, we're also anticipating a large amount of coal-fired power plants to be retired in the next 5 to 10 years. So we're kind of in a perfect storm of retiring old generation that we've had around for 40, 50, 60 years in some cases with unprecedented load growth. And so fortunately today, had we had this problem, even 10 years ago, I think the predominant solution all of our utilities would have been running to would be just the gas resources. Fortunately, the prices for solar and wind and batteries have come down really significantly over the past 10 years. And in some cases, we've seen prices decline sometimes up to 90%. And so these resources are available today. We are seeing some pretty significant growth throughout the Southeast for these types of resources, predominantly on the solar side. I was looking at the generator interconnection queues earlier today. That's kind of the line that all of the developers get in to connect to the grid. And across the Southeast, we have well over 100,000 megawatts of solar projects, standalone solar projects currently in the generator interconnection queues across the Southeast. And to give you a sense of scale of what that means, the Southeastern region as a whole is something like 200 gigawatts or 250 gigawatts of peak capacity, if I recall, and depending on what states you include and which states you don't include.
Right.
So we have a significant amount of utility scale solar that's being proposed. We have about 40 gigawatts of hybrid projects, that's solar plus batteries. Then we have about 20 gigawatts worth of batteries. And then comparatively, just in the queue, we've only are seeing about 17 gigawatts worth of gas resources. And so we're waiting to see that there is likely to be even more gas resources added into the queues here over the next couple of years. But for right now, they're not in the generator interconnection queues. And if they're not in there, they're not going to get built in a timely fashion. Similarly, we hear a lot of discussions around carbon capture sequestration, around nuclear resources. Georgia just recently brought online the Vogtle units 3 and 4 after something like 15 years in development. And so while those resources are going to be helpful for our region, when we're talking about the load growth in the next 5 years, the question is what can get built in the next 5 years? And it's going to be solar, wind, batteries, and gas resources. And then on the flip side, you do have a load component. So you have distributed energy resources. We don't work that heavily on DERs. Our region, much of our region doesn't exist within a regional transmission organization, making those resources a bit more difficult. But rooftop solar, batteries at home, aggregating electric vehicles and thermostats, all of these technologies are going to be important to keep up the reliability of the system, but also keep the costs down. So lots of new solutions, lots of things in planning process right now. And, while we are seeing kind of a resurgence of additional gas resources, I think we're just kind of now at the dawn of a significant build out of these new renewable resources across the Southeast.
Yeah. Excellent. And thanks for that. And Priya, I want to turn to you because you represent many companies that are building or proposing to build some of the data centers or the factories driving a lot of this load growth. But SEBA members are pressing utilities and regulators to support these companies' clean energy and climate goals and make them a partner in these efforts. And I'm wondering how the customers of utilities, prospective customers and existing customers, can play a positive role and are working to play a positive role in encouraging utilities and regulators to find the cleaner options available, which may well include things that the customers themselves can do to help mitigate load growth and bring cleaner energy resources to bear to solve for that.
Yeah, absolutely, Jeff. First, I think, let's look at the new drivers for load growth. You already touched on that in your opening, Jeff, but, the new drivers include data centers, expansion of manufacturing and industrial processes, electrification of transportation and buildings, and also cryptocurrency mining are kind of the big areas for load growth. And the load profiles of each of those sources is actually a little bit different. Some are large and lumpy, and others are kind of more gradual increases. So electrification will be a more gradual increase. And one of the biggest load drivers, which you touched on, for data centers, is actually artificial intelligence. So traditionally, data centers have had very kind of large constant loads. And what I'm hearing from folks in that industry is that actually AI might create an opportunity for data centers to play a bigger role in demand response because of the way the processes are run for that industry. I think there is potential for some of this load across those industries to help bring clean energy resources to the grid, whether that's through innovative financing structures or new programs, in terms of kind of bringing clean energy. And there's also a lot of untapped potential from demand side resources too. So that includes distributed generation, energy efficiency, demand response, virtual power plants that can help offset these load drivers as well. So, what we're seeing is large energy customers are having conversations with their utilities across the country to try and find ways to be part of the solution as well. There's really a desire to optimize and maximize resources in the existing grid first. Find solutions to fix and clear interconnection queues. So, kind of across the country, that would bring kind of 2.5 terawatts of clean energy projects online, which is huge. And of course, to kind of maximize carbon-free firm options, which is something that even utilities like say is needed for a reliability perspective. And so that could include things like renewables plus storage in the near term. And then in the longer term, long duration storage, advanced nuclear, and kind of advanced geothermal. And I think, Simon touched on this point, but that's important too. What's feasible in the near term and what's needed in the longer term, and kind of thinking about those two dimensions. And then again, in addition to that, I think there's an interest in regional and interregional transmission lines as a resource adequacy resource as well, because that can help connect more power generation and storage in a timely manner while supporting system reliability. So I think there's really kind of this broader suite, and I think there's a desire to really consider a wider set of solutions, to meet this challenge that we're facing right now, that really balances customer costs and reliability with global competitiveness and emissions and clean energy goals that these customers have as well.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, that's a great framing of the stages of problem solving that we have, I think, to get through here for sure. I did want to let our audience members know that we will be taking questions. I see that we have a few in the queue already, and addressing them largely at the end of the event here today. Though we'll keep them in mind as we see opportunity to come into the conversation that we're having right now. So I think we should, though, get back to kind of the fundamental issue that has really reared its head in the last, 6 months, perhaps longer for those who have been paying attention, which is this change in the trajectory of load growth. And I think it's really interesting to learn more about how the utilities in question and the regulators and everyone involved figure out what's going to happen next. And Simon and Maggie, I'm wondering if you could help us understand, how does all this happen? Who comes up with the load growth forecast? Who determines what mix of generation is needed to meet that load? Who decides what grid expansions are needed? And what is the balance of power and information between utilities and regulators and advocates and customers in terms of knowing how these big top line numbers emerge and how to double check them?
Great question, Simon. Do you want me to start?
Yeah, I'll have you go first, and I'll supplement.
Okay, I think we'll have some overlap on this one. Yeah, these are such great questions. How does this happen? Primarily through the utilities. So the utilities are doing their load forecasts. They do load forecasts in a couple of different ways. Some of the different types of customers and types of load growth, will show up in different ways in load forecasting, different methods. So, for instance, there's your economic and population modeling to try and figure out how load is growing in that way. But these utilities also get requests from larger customers to interconnect. And say, okay, I'm going to build a factory here. I will need, 1 gigawatt, 500 megawatts, 3 gigawatts, whatever, some of these are really big numbers. And the utility has to sort of estimate the likelihood of that, large load interconnection actually coming. And there's a lot of risk involved because, especially because a lot of these large loads are making these it's a different kind of interconnection request than we usually talk about, but it's still an interconnection request in the same sort of way. And the utility has to decide, how much of these it's going to rely on, because if it assumes they all come online, builds a whole bunch of power, and that load doesn't show up, that's a large cost on its remaining customers. On the flip side, if it has a too conservative assumption and doesn't build enough, then there's going to be some serious constraints on the system. So that's the way that the utility looks at it. They will present their load forecast to a regulator, usually through an IRP, integrated resource plan process. They present both the load forecast and their plan to meet that load. And these happen in the Southeast anywhere from 2 to 3 years is typical. And the regulator then is the one that looks at both the load forecast side and the generation plan side to see if the utility has looked at everything that makes sense, and determines does the load forecast seem reasonable, does the generation plan seem reasonable, and then we'll have a vote to approve or change, or there's different mechanisms in different states. But I think that part is really key, and it goes back to what we were talking about earlier about all the different alternatives, because the other thing that is key for these regulators is to make sure that the utilities have fairly evaluated all of these alternatives and haven't just, again, gone back to their old standby of building a new gas plant because it's what they know, it's what gets them the highest returns for their shareholders, and it's what is the easiest for them to operate. So these are not easy questions. I certainly, I think it's a tough job right now to be a utility load forecaster or planner, because it's at such a critical moment. I know there's a lot weighing on these decisions right now, but it is so important that we get it right now. So I'll stop and see what Simon has to add.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything that Maggie just said. Just to add some additional color to the situation, a lot of the new load that we're seeing is it's been undone, or it hasn't been done in the region. It's new, it's novel. I really think crypto is kind of the biggest kind of unknown for a lot of folks. It's still kind of a strange thing. Whereas historically, if Ford came in and said, "Oh, we'd like to build a manufacturing plant," the utility could plan on that manufacturing plant being there for the next 40, 50, 60 years. The big question everybody's asking is, if crypto comes in or if AI comes in, we know computers change really quite often. And so is that load going to be stable over the course of time necessary to pay for the investments for the transmission, for the generation? And that's a big question everybody's still wrestling with. Part of the difficulty is some of the large manufacturers are literally shopping for the best locations to interconnect. And so they may go to TVA, they may go to Southern Company, they may go to Entergy and say, we've got 1,000 megawatts of load, a gigawatt of load. What sort of deals can we get by coming to your state? And some utilities, what they'll do is they'll count that as prospective new demand that they may have to plan for. We saw here recently in Mississippi where Amazon announced 1,000 megawatts worth of new data centers for the state. It's transformational for that state. It's going to be $10 billion worth of economic development for one of the poorest states in the country. It's going to be an exceptionally helpful thing for Mississippians. But in order to serve 1,000 megawatts, Entergy Mississippi is only a 3,000 megawatt utility. And so they're going to have to increase their generation portfolio by a gigawatt in about 3 years. And so we're running up against the constraints of we can build the load faster than we can build the generation. And that's that's another struggle that we're all kind of facing right now.
Yeah. And you bring up that, Entergy Mississippi doesn't have the generation. One might presume that there's some other power next door that might be able to serve it. I don't know if both of y'all can kind of explain what the dynamics are of the regulated utility kind of complex in the Southeast and how that differs from other parts of the country, where you might have more integrated, kind of energy markets and a more competitive kind of approach to building new generation to serve new load.
Yeah, well, right now everybody in the Southeast is looking for generation, and so we've got, let's see, TVA issued an RFP, or request for proposals, a couple of weeks ago for existing generation, not only in their footprint but kind of nearby. All the Entergy opcos are issuing their own RFPs for existing generation. Southern Company is about to issue an RFP for additional capacity, which will include the opportunity for existing generation. So everybody is kind of looking under each and every couch cushion to find every single megawatt of potential power that they could find, and they're using that to barter with these industrial customers to say, we have megawatts, our neighbors don't. And
Right.
so it's a form of competitive of competition within the vertically integrated monopolies that we have down here. But when you compare the amount of generation that is in the generator interconnection queues, for instance, in the regional transmission organizations or the organized markets versus what we have in the vertically integrated markets down here in the Southeast, we have way more generation showing up in places like Texas, MISO, PJM, comparatively to our region. And so having these independent power producers, many of them are, for instance, like our companies that are our members, are trying to get ahead. They see where the puck is going and they're trying to skate towards it. And so they don't have the same restraints that many of our regulated utilities have, where really every step of the way they need to go get regulatory approval before they start constructing. Our developers can really quickly go into the generator interconnection queues. They can sit there, they can work with their landowners, and they can prepare for when construction is ripe. And
Right.
so it's valuable to have those markets nearby. And it would be exceptionally valuable for our region to consider thinking about developing some sort of organized market.
Okay. Priya, I know that. Oh, sorry, Maggie, I think you had something.
Just to add to that, back to the sort of the previous question too, about where you have load kind of shopping around as well around the Southeast. Obviously, if we had an RTO, that covered the whole region, you wouldn't be building 3 or 4 gas plants for the same load in individual utilities. And then it's only going to show up in one place. And then the flip side of that, obviously, is that we don't have reserve margin sharing here in the Southeast. So each of these individual utilities are, in addition to their load, this load forecast that has increased a lot recently. You add a reserve margin onto that, and that's another reason we see such a large build out or proposal for big gas build out. And then the last piece is the transmission piece. We don't have the regional transmission organization planning out a transmission at any sort of regional level. We're hopeful that Order 1920 will help us get a little closer. But again, we're not we're far from that point right now.
Certainly. Yeah. Good point. Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, big transmission planning order, but going to take some time. And I do want to circle back to the dynamics in the Southeast and how they kind of influence how alternatives to big gas power plants are built. But I wanted to ask first, real quick, Priya, I know that CEBA, the Clean Energy Buyers Association, has been active in kind of pushing for kind of regulatory and policy reforms that enable new demand, that is your companies, to go enable new cleaner supply. And I don't know if you can talk about how the buying power of CEBA and its kind of companies with its clean energy mandates can drive kind of innovative approaches to securing the clean energy that is needed, and how those techniques do or do not function effectively in the Southeast markets we're talking about right now. Oh, you're muted, Priya.
Oh, here we go. Sorry. The mute button was in a different place. So let me start by first saying that, kind of SEBA's policy priorities are really chosen based on areas that pose the biggest barriers to accessing cost-effective, reliable, clean energy kind of at the market system level. So I think what makes SEBA unique and effective in our policy work is the fact that our community represents a diverse set of energy customer voices, where for many, actually, their core business is not energy, but yet accessing clean energy is critical to their businesses. And so with that, kind of our key focus areas in the US are really on market access and transmission, since those are the critical areas for better access to clean energy for all customers. And I'll start with transmission and then go back to market. So like on the transmission side, most of our efforts have really focused at the national level on reforms around planning, permitting, and paying, what we call kind of the 3 Ps. And so this has included kind of engaging with Congress, on getting transmission funding into the Inflation Reduction Act, or, more recently engaging with FERC on the final transmission planning and backstop rules in Order 1920. But we are also building out more regional transmission work and bringing the importance of this to state venues in which we engage, such as utility planning processes. And that's where, our market access work kind of comes into play as well. So our market access work at SEBA is really focused on expanding and improving organized wholesale electricity markets across the country, and expanding and improving access to clean energy through utilities, particularly where those markets don't exist. And that's driven primarily through integrated resource planning and kind of customer programs. And so with that, we have been particularly focused on the Southeast region and the West, since organized wholesale markets don't exist in those two regions, and customers are limited in their options to access clean energy. But of course, both those regions are in very different places in this journey, and so I won't go into all the details of that. But as a result, how we engage looks different. But our key audiences in our policy engagement efforts are really state level decision makers, regulatory bodies, and utilities. And coming back to kind of the Southeast more specifically, again, since we've touched on this a number of times, since organized wholesale markets do not exist, we've actually been engaging much more deeply in utility integrated resource planning and the expansion of clean energy customer programs, particularly across the Carolinas, Georgia, the TVA 7-state region, and Louisiana. Since there are kind of critical moments and the active kind of integrated resource planning happening right now, and those decisions or the approvals around those impact investment decisions that are then made by the utilities. So that's a little bit in terms of kind of how we've been engaging and why we've been engaging in those particular areas.
Right.
Just because we do have a number of members that are located in those places too. And again, as we've been talking about, there's this confluence of load growth and kind of a push for a lot of natural gas to kind of meet that new load as well. And we really want to try and expand the suite of solutions that is utilized in meeting this need.
Gotcha. I know that SEBA recently kind of reached an agreement, I believe, with Georgia Power, the Southern Company subsidiary that just had its kind of emergency IRP approved. That included a lot of new combustion, turbines, but it also included some, I think, pledges to develop some customer-centered options for enabling clean power development. Can you tell us more about what kind of stuff is on the table now?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, what I'll say about that is again, so again, the this emergency kind of IRP was approved, or there was a settlement agreement that was approved by the Georgia Commission last month, and that settlement actually includes a provision that would require Georgia Power to create a new customer clean energy procurement program that allows energy customers to bring their own clean energy into Georgia Power's system through kind of a sleeved power purchase agreement. And they've agreed to work with SEBA and customers to develop the design of that program over the coming months. And they've committed to including this in the suite of options that are presented in the 2025 IRP, which is kind of part of their normal IRP cycle. So it is something that I think, customers and others will be looking for in that IRP. What I'd say is that these this power purchase provisions, again, it provides an additional option that didn't exist before for customers to access clean energy. And I think it's an important first step for opening a new path for Georgia to have kind of expanded options for meeting the load growth beyond the limited options that Georgia Power put forward in this last kind of IRP, which are quite costly for ratepayers, and added kind of a lot of gas peaker plants. And again, what I'll highlight is customers do want to be part of these solutions for meeting that load growth. And part of the larger issue, which we've touched on in this conversation as well, relates to the fact that there isn't an organized wholesale electricity market, and so we're looking to see what are other options for trying to bring more clean energy into the system, and so this is a potential way to incorporate that.
Right. And I'm going to attempt to quickly summarize the difference between wholesale and vertically integrated. In wholesale markets, individual customers can go buy their own electricity. They can even contract for a new generation source, solar, wind, batteries, to supply that power and kind of finance the construction of it. In vertically integrated, everything's owned and built by the utilities, and then they socialize the cost of that capital expense across their rate base. Very roughly speaking, there's an important distinction to be made there, because it sounds like if the big data centers, factories, other kind of big commercial industrial customers that want to locate in Georgia, Mississippi, other parts of the Southeast, did have the power to kind of go out and procure and even get new clean energy built, that might drive more clean energy for everyone else. On the other hand, I guess I should ask why it's important to keep in mind the regular kind of everyday customers of these utilities when it comes to their plans. And I know Simon and Maggie, you guys have been working for a long time on trying to get the regulators involved in these integrated resource plans to kind of check the assumptions that are coming out of some of the utilities about why they say they need more gas, or why they say that solar or batteries or wind power or energy efficiency, or asking customers to not use power at the very hottest days of the summer or coldest evenings or mornings of the winter when grid demand is at its peak. What are some of the key challenges that you guys have seen in kind of truing up the actual value of those clean alternatives?
Yeah, the big thing, especially out of the Georgia Power Integrated Resource Plan, and we've seen a lot of our utilities across the Southeast kind of tack in the same direction, is the wintertime. 2 years ago, we had Winter Storm Elliott, which caused power outages across the Tennessee Valley Authority region, across the Duke operating areas over in the Carolinas, in Kentucky, in South Carolina. A year prior, we saw some major power outages in Texas with ERCOT, and during the wintertime, of course. And so solar performs exceptionally well during the afternoons and during the summer times. That's historically when a lot of our utilities in the Southeast have planned for the system to reach the system peak. Now, as we are not only building more solar, but as winters become much more variable, and we are starting to see the limitations, frankly, of the natural gas pipeline systems throughout the country, everybody's really starting to get much more concerned about what do we do during the wintertime. And so, for instance, back in the Georgia Power IRP that was most recently approved, Georgia Power, they're trying to build these combustion turbines at an existing natural gas site, so they have some pipeline infrastructure there. But the company was very frank through that whole docketed proceeding that they are not relying on natural gas during these extreme weather events during the wintertime. They're intentionally building 72 hours worth of oil storage on site to maintain, because we saw some pretty significant degradation of pipeline pressure, which you need a high enough pressure in order to run some of these newer, more efficient power stations. And so, I think we're going to see more of our companies starting to talk about this wintertime concern. It's winter peaking is often 6 to 9 a.m. in the morning. It's difficult for solar resources to be available there unless you're adding battery resources. The flip side here is wind performs exceptionally well during the nighttime and during winter. And so if you have, like what Priya and Maggie have been saying, if you have better regional transmission connections where you can import wind whenever you need it, and you can export solar whenever you don't, that's how we make a more efficient system overall, not only on a reliability standpoint, but on a cost basis, because we're able to import low cost resources whenever they're available, and then export resources when we don't need them. Maybe our neighbors need them at that time. And so, we're talking with a lot of experts about how to properly evaluate all of these resources now. Historically, natural gas, coal, nuclear resources, historically they would get 100% accreditation, or the utilities would just assume, oh yes, they're always going to be around because we can turn them on and turn them off. The reality is showing that's not the case. And so we need to properly accredit those resources, as we're also properly accrediting wind, solar, batteries, what other, virtual power plants are going to come up with their own accreditation values. And then properly modeling a good mix of those resources in these integrated resource planning dockets. And so it's just, the system is getting much more complicated. But that's because we have so many tools now in the toolkit to try and ensure that we maintain reliability and low costs in the system.
Gotcha.
Yeah, if I can just tack on to that, I mean, I think it's on the regulators to make sure that these utilities are, emphasizing that I in IRP, everything is integrated. So historically, especially in the Southeast, a lot of utilities have not looked closely at the demand side. Energy efficiency, even like rooftop solar, demand response, all of that is just done at the very beginning of an IRP modeling. It becomes part of the load forecast, and that's it. It doesn't change. It's not dynamic. It's not growing or anything like that. And then the other side of that is transmission. A lot of these utilities are not looking at regional or interregional transmission as a part of their load forecast or their IRP process. And so that's absolutely critical that we integrate these things together, and we look at other ways to, really plan a system for this, level of reliability or resource adequacy. I mean, the days when we could pick 1 or 2 hours in the year and plan the system for that, those are long gone. They're not coming back. We need to just move on from that. It's, we're looking at all, 87, 60 hours of the year, making sure there is, there are going to be enough resources. They're diverse enough. They're not going to, have issues on cold winter mornings, and hot summer afternoons and everything in between. And it's also not lost on me, as someone who lost power during Winter Storm Elliott, that our utilities are taking the blackouts that happened because of failures of fossil fuel resources, especially gas, but also some coal, and now using that to essentially scare their regulators into approving more gas. I mean, this is more of the system, more of the problem. And we have seen just an absolute explosion in the demand for gas for power generation. Mm-hmm. It used to be, 10 10, 12, 15 years ago, it was just a small portion of the demand for gas in our region. And now it is the vast majority. And so it is the power plants that are causing a lot of the issues on the gas system. And so adding more power plants to an already constrained system is not going to solve anything.
Right. I should probably bring up the elephant in the room, which is that in vertically integrated utility territories, utilities make money by spending money, in particular by investing money in new capital stuff, including big power plants. And that does present a problematic set of incentives for utilities to perhaps underrepresent in their planning processes options that might allow their customers to bear lower cost burdens in the future from alternatives that reduce the amount of capital investment required. And this is a fundamental problem, an issue in utility, kind of regulatory processes. I don't know I don't know if you guys can point to places, instances in which utilities and regulators are actively figuring out how to align what is best from a carbon reduction standpoint, or even from a reliability standpoint, diversifying the resource mix so that a problem in the gas system doesn't, exacerbate, a problem in the winter. How is that being aligned with utility incentive structures? Is that happening in any way in this region?
There are a few examples that you can point to. So, again, I know we're talking a lot about Georgia, but frankly, there's a lot of innovation that's going on in the Georgian regulatory sphere. One of the things in Georgia is when Georgia Power signs a power purchase agreement with a third party, a solar developer, a battery developer, even in some cases a natural gas owner that isn't a subsidiary or sometimes is a subsidiary, they can earn a profit effectively off of those contracts. So historically, it was you only get to earn a profit off of what you build and own yourself. In Georgia, they're allowed what's called an additional sum. But effectively, what it is, it's an incentive for the company to evaluate all contractual options. And what that does is it means that they can go out and do competitive procurement. They can find the lowest cost resources, and then they get a fixed return on investment for those power purchase agreements, even if they don't own the assets. We are seeing kind of a mix of these contracts now where it could be a power purchase agreement. It could be what many of the utilities called a build, own, transfer, where a third party will build the facility and then hand over the keys on operations day. And then all of a sudden now the utility is owning them. And so that way you kind of split between who's building it and who's dealing with all the construction components of it versus who's owning it and operating it and maintaining it. And then we are also seeing some asset acquisitions where somebody's previously owned a generation facility for a long time. They're trying to get out from underneath it, so they'll flip it and sell it to the companies, to the utilities directly. Regardless of the structure that we have, and some other states, Mississippi, Arkansas, I think Louisiana, they all have some of these components where you can earn a rate of return off of a power purchase agreement in some instances. Mm-hmm. All of those still require regulatory approval. So if you have a power purchase agreement, you have to bring it to the public service commissions for their review and approval. And sometimes those are they make it through just fine, and others they get bogged down in negotiations. And there was a really large example a number of years ago where a regulated utility was trying to buy wind power out of western Oklahoma. Arkansas approved the deal, Louisiana approved the deal, but then the Public Utility Commission of Texas didn't approve the deal. And so when you didn't have all three of the states in alignment, all three regulatory bodies approving it, the project ultimately ended up dying. And so the utility had to come back and restructure how they were planning that wind project. It caused a lot of delays. The prices went up. The value to the ratepayers went down ultimately. But it still provides significant benefits to the ratepayers compared to the next alternative, which was to build additional combined cycle natural gas units. And so it's throughout all of this, regardless of what structure we're doing, the state regulators really have to be involved and really stay on top of making sure what's happening is going to be in all the ratepayers' best interests.
Yeah. And Priya, I wanted to ask the same question about aligning incentives from the perspective of the big power users, and where we see, I would imagine, for example, in compact, in congested areas like, Data Center Alley in Northern Virginia, that we hear reports of, data center expansions essentially being kind of difficult or impossible due to a lack of capacity on the grid writ large. I would imagine that a lot of that is based on managing the peak demands of those data center expansions, and that there might be opportunities for the interests of data center operators or other big industrial power users that are seeking to increase the share of electricity they're using to align with the utilities and regulators who are trying to figure out how to manage load growth within the constraints of the grid and the generation we have today, to find opportunities for those new loads to shift when they use power, to make sure that they don't use as much on peak, to find a way to incentivize on-site clean energy, solar and batteries, instead of, say, diesel backup generators, or in addition to those backup systems. But I don't know if that is an active part of the discussions that are happening between big C&I commercial industrial customers and utilities when it comes to figuring out where they can build, let alone whether it's filtering up to the integrated resource plan discussions we're talking about here.
Yeah, so as I said earlier, there are active conversations happening between these large energy buyers and a number of utilities on ways in which looking at at the system more holistically, and assets that are kind of on both sides of the meter, so to speak, and how to utilize some of those things in new innovative ways that actually bring broader system benefits. So I will say that this is probably an area for kind of that's ripe for kind of further conversations. You may have seen, I know that Microsoft, Nucor, Amazon, Google, and Duke Energy. Again, it's financing structures. It's other ways in which you can actually bring clean energy assets on, but then thinking through ways of then kind of utilizing that for broader system benefits. I will say again, from a SEBA perspective, our members are large energy customers, but our vision is actually customer driven clean energy for all. So from that perspective, we are also we want to ensure that the system is decarbonizing and it's benefiting all customers, not just a select handful of customers. That is important, and I think that a number of companies are starting to have that type of conversation in terms of how can they help to be bringing kind of broader system benefits in addition to getting access to clean energy.
Yeah, gotcha. I wanted to turn real quick to some audience questions. I'm going to kind of conflate two into one. We've been talking so much about how uncertainty and plays a huge role in making this a more challenging set of problems to deal with. Uncertainty about how much load is going to show up when, uncertainty about the relative kind of reliability qualities that different resources provide. And we've got one audience member who mentions that it's been hard to get data in Colorado from Excel Energy from outside analysis, despite being regulated monopolies. They keep it secret. Only during rate cases do public advocates get to view selected data. Asking about data transparency issues. What do you all make of data transparency? Where is it not? What can regulators do on that front? And what is reasonable against utilities saying, hey, we can't tell our competitors in other regions who's trying to get a deal to locate in our region? I'm not sure where the balance should be, where the line should be drawn.
Yeah, this is huge, and this is a really big issue in the Southeast, in particular. So I empathize with our friends in Colorado. We've also had a lot of issues getting data on all sorts of utility projections, plans, everything like that, and it's a constant back and forth for advocates in the Southeast. And a lot of times it's also a trade-off because, if we are in a docket, if we are, intervening, we will have to sign a confidentiality agreement or some sort of similar to be able to see some of these confidential data or documents, and then we're not able to talk about those publicly. So the public is the one that's really missing out, and the commissions and stakeholders have really, there's a lot of talk about wanting public participation in these sorts of big decisions around IRPs, rate cases, and all of that. But that's going to be difficult because the balance of power of just how much do advocates, let alone the public, know about what's going on, not just what's in these load forecasts. And, I don't think we're asking for like which companies are going to, have proposed to go where, but just more granular detail about things like, well, how much of your load forecast is, manufacturing versus residential, and just some like basic levels of information. And that is primarily driven by the commission. I mean, there's state codes, state legislation that could happen to open things up as well. But there's a lot of leeway that commissions have in determining what is considered confidential in this utility data. And from what I've seen, the utilities tend to assume things are confidential until they are told specifically they have to provide it.
Right. We also had another question about what new tools, technologies, or service providers are best situated to help utilities and regulators assess, well, in this case, connection requests, determine the best option for supplying that load. And this is getting back to perhaps a question about how to utilize what data is available, or how to best kind of gut check questions about like which resources are going to be best for reliability or best for cost. But I don't know if these best tools, technologies, and services are or are not being applied to solving the problems that we're trying to solve in these IRPs. And if not, how come? And if so, how do they help?
That's a really hard question to answer because best for whom, I think is how you want to posit the question. Because from a utilities perspective, the best thing is the quickest, easiest thing that they understand and that they know. And so that's why a lot of our utilities are so focused on gas. They understand it. It's easy. They think they can flip a switch and turn it on and operate it. I see a lot of questions around distributed generation in the chat here. Distributed generation is great, but it's not going to be enough to serve the amounts of load that we're dealing with. I mean, like to give additional scale here and sense here, California is doing exceptionally well in the country with regards to how much distributed generation they have on their grid. They're reaching really high levels of penetration of renewable, but that's a mixture of both utility scale and rooftop solar in particular. We don't have anything to that extent really anywhere else in the country. And even in California, they're starting to roll back provisions regarding net metering. In many of the states in the Southeast, net metering is almost a dirty word, where we're not getting compensated to the level that you would normally. You're not getting one for one. And so it's difficult for residents, for commercial, for industrial customers to really look at a net metered resource or a distributed resource and say, yes, it's going to be easy for me to offset my bill with that resource alone. And so there is some value in looking at like community resources. I know Minnesota is a leader in that type of resource. But again, back to the context of scale, Georgia Power in the latest integrated resource plan, they are a 16,000 megawatt peak utility. That's how much power they're using at their peak during that summertime. They said, as we got done in April, that they have kind of a soft view of adding an additional 21,000 megawatts of additional load, nearly doubling in some, more than doubling in size over the next 10 years. And so at this point, it's a matter of we're going to need it all. We're going to need to max out as much rooftop as we possibly can, but it's still going to leave a huge bucket for utility scale development that needs to be done as well. And then there's value in having geographic distribution, and so you're not so reliant on one specific location. Once you start looking at geographic distribution, that's where transmission comes in. And so all of these technologies work and can work together. They're going to have to work together. It's just a matter of do we have the right policies in place to enable all those technologies? And right now, DERs, especially down in the Southeast, because we don't have an RTO, DERs are just not in the money, so to speak.
Right. I know we've run out of time, and without answering a whole bunch of questions that folks had to ask, we do appreciate that. And we're going to be taking a look at how to answer them in the course of our reporting. I did want to ask all our panelists if you have any last thoughts, whether they be kind of key points you'd like to make to our audience or key objectives that you and your organizations have on the docket next to deal with the situations that you're dealing with. What would they be? And I don't know, Simon, if I might just start with you.
Yeah, we're in kind of a really tough spot right now where, like I said at the beginning, we're expecting a lot of load growth. We're hoping for a lot of retirements. There are going to be some really tough discussions and decisions to be made over the next 3 to 5 years. One of those big discussions is going to be, do we keep existing generation resources on longer, or do we try to build out new generation resources? For a lot of these utilities, it is going to be really easy for them to say, look, we want to keep these coal plants online for as long as we possibly can. Our view is, if you have a choice between adding significant megawatts of new renewables, clean technology, efficiency, demand response, all these different technologies, but it requires some additional gas to get you up over that hump, especially combustion turbines. We need to be thinking about what our options are. Do we want to leave those coal plants open for the next decade? Or do we want to think about a mix of different technologies? So I'm not going to answer that question. Everyone's going to have to answer that question on their own, and each utility is going to have to deal with it on their own. But we've got a lot of really difficult discussions and decisions to be made over the next 3 to 5 years.
Gotcha. Maggie, let me ask you what your takeaway thoughts are.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is such a great discussion that we're having, and this is really, the start. And I appreciate and agree with, what my fellow panelists have said today too. I know there's a lot of skepticism about this load growth in particular. Is it going to show up the way it's, the utilities are describing? But my sense is that doesn't actually really matter very much, which I know is kind of a controversial opinion, because if it doesn't, this is our trial run, because we know that this kind of load is coming. There's, electrification coming in the future. There is, additional manufacturing if it isn't coming next year or in the next 3 years, the next 5, 10, years, certainly. So my worry is that this sort of panicked reaction and knee-jerk reactions by a number of utilities means that we don't have the right processes in place and the right level of transparency to meet that kind of load that we're going to see at some point with a diverse, sort of all tools in the toolbox method, in a way that is again, integrated and, across the region and interregional, because at the end of the day, what's most important is that we decarbonize in a way that is cost effective and can keep the lights on. And absolutely, we can do that. But right now, it seems like it's been shown that we don't have the processes in place to do the kind of proactive planning that it's going to take to be able to do that. And that's what we're working on.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'll just round it. I agree with all the points that Simon and Maggie have made. And I'll just, I know we're way over time. So the one thing I'll say is I think we've reached a stage where like we are going to need to be uncomfortable to come up with the right kind of solutions, for the challenge that the system is facing right now. And so, I'm looking forward to kind of working, with the community, with utilities, with regulators, with advocates and others to really think about the system holistically, and how we get there. So that's all I'll say. But I do think the kind of feeling uncomfortable, I think we will need to feel uncomfortable in order to solve these issues.
Wonderful. Well, on that getting comfortable with discomfort note, I will bring this panel to a close. I want to say thanks again to our panelists, Priya Barua, Maggie Schober, Simon Mahan. Really appreciate your time and appreciate all of you in the audience for joining us. Please subscribe to our newsletter. Please find out ways that you can support us, and please help us bring you the news that you need to make this energy transition happen. And have a great day.